And sometimes if all we do is focus on debt, it might actually be leading us away from our overall financial objectives, right? If I'm trying to get to better health and I go to the doctor for an ER visit because my appendix burst, right? Okay, I saw the doctor, checked that box. I mean, he would have told me if there was something else that was needed at that point. I got my appendix taken care of. I'm in good health, right? But is that going to get me to optimal health? Like, no, right? And maybe that's a poor analogy of it all, but sometimes people focus so much on one part that they might be missing or might be actually leading them away from what they're trying to accomplish somewhere else too.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Money Maverick podcast. I'm Tim Turley, your host for the show today, coming to you live from the Money Maverick studios in Salt Lake City, Utah. We're excited to have our Maverick today, our guest Maverick. I've known David for a couple of years now, and he is an amazing human being. If you ever get to meet Dave or know Dave, not only is he just the nicest guy you'll ever meet, but he's incredibly good at what he does, teaching people about finances and money. And so we're great to have David with us today. Let me give you a little bit of background on David Mullen. He's currently living in Skiatook, Oklahoma. Did I say that right, David? Before I go any further.
Skiatook. It's a tough one, right? That's good.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's good. Okay. But he's out in Oklahoma, which is in the Tulsa area, with his wife of, is it 14 years now, David?
Yes.
14,
yeah.
14 years. His wife named Leah. They have 6 children that keeps them very busy. David is a certified financial planner, and he has been practicing as a principles-based planner for about 6 years now. He operates remotely, like many of us do, with his clients who are now in 26 states across the country. David has a lot of really great specialties. He works heavily with the medical community and resident physicians. He loves to be with his family when he's not doing that, teaching his little kiddos how to change tires, work hard, and help others. He does prefer hunting over fishing, cold over hot temperatures, and he's very happy the college football season has started again. And so that's fun. So David, one of his expertise is, which again, you'll notice as you listen to these podcast episodes, that my goal as the host is to always bring people on here that are way smarter than me. And David is not the exception at all. He is way smarter than I am. And so he knows so much. One of his specialties is he's helped many people with high student loan debt and how to understand and navigate the specific repayment plan options, along with actually the more important part of how those payment plan options should fit into their overall financial plan and the best way to manage them long term. David, besides being a certified financial planner, he has a Bachelor's of Science degree from Brigham Young University and with a minor in business. So with that being said, David Mullen, welcome to the Money Maverick podcast. Glad to have you here.
Hey, thank you. I'm glad to be here, Tim.
Yeah, we wanted to make sure you were in our first initial group of shows because of how awesome you are. So I'm really excited to have you here. David, tell us a little bit, just before we get into what you're really good at, and especially about student loan debt and that kind of a thing. Tell us about your background. Where did you grow up, and how did your childhood kind of shape maybe what you thought about money, and how you got into what you're doing now?
Well, that's good. I mean, and you start in the past and where we've made mistakes, and hopefully we've learned from them, right? So that's good. I had a great childhood, and quite a bit of exposure regarding money, actually. So my father was in the financial services industry, focused mostly on insurance and annuities and that types of stuff, but really focused on helping people. I saw that a ton, and it had an impact on me. Did well, took care of us. I learned to like nice things, which wasn't the wonderful thing, I guess. But we grew up out in the country, and the reason he did that is so he could manufacture work for us, and he did a really good job of that. And he felt like, hey, if I can teach my kids how to work, they'll be able to take care of themselves. And I hated it at the time, but but now, geez, that's something that I think is lacking with a lot of us. I mean, we're always looking for ways to make our lives easier, to have less work, and not that we just want to have more work for the sake of it, um, but there's something to be said for just not shying away from that. That's really powerful. I'm glad that my parents did that. Um, I was homeschooled for a number of years because I just couldn't pay attention in school. It just moved slow. So, and that was back before we had a lot of resources. So I really credit my mother with being able to take care of those things too. But yeah, shaping about money and how it worked. I mean, my parents were always um, very helpful with their resources. Really worked to help others. I remember my dad putting a lot of our friends to work when they would come out and stay the night. The next day they'd get them up. He'd put them to work too. But he'd pay them. And I remember a number of people though that he would pay that were just having hard times coming out and giving them something to do so they had the value of at least earning that to some degree or another. My gosh, just all the time it feels like that was happening. Um, so that was always really helpful to see and to see the what it did to people along the way too. I was always interested in the financial services industry, working with people. Had some brothers that went in through it. A brother that was heavy on the investment side for, I mean, pretty much his whole career until just here recently, but a good 25, 30 years that he spent in there. Another one that's been in the banking side for years and years too. Um, spent a lot of years during the college years going and interning with my brother's firm on the investment side, or at least the firm that he was at um, up in Minnesota, and got exposed to a lot of different angles on that, global equities and um, stocks and bonds and fixed income and alternative investments. That was really fun to see. Spent a good amount of time digging into that, learning how to vet managers, and seeing what would be best for these large institutional clients that the firm managed. So it was an exciting time and learned a lot. Had a learning curve that was just like almost straight up, just hearing all these different terms and stuff. And but it was great, kind of travel through a lot of that, and over the years, just taking all that stuff and forward and where my line was going to be carved out. Was kind of a winding road, but I believe it was guided, and we're happy. So
Well, that's good. I think we broke up a little bit at the end, but I think we heard what you said. And why do you think the youth of today, whatever you want to call them, millennials, the Gen Z, whatever you call them, why do you think there's such a challenge with younger people today when it comes to working, kind of that work ethic kind of a thing? I mean, a lot of kids do really good working hard, but why do you think there's an issue with that?
gosh, it's probably a lot of reasons for it. Maybe, I mean, I think our society does really well. We have just comfortable lifestyles. We all have air conditioning. I mean, even people in the poverty level have smartphones and cable TV and that kinds of stuff. So we're just able to entertain ourselves and do other things that don't require us to work like we used to. Um, I don't
Well,
know.
we can probably get into a whole podcast on the cycles of human civilization, how we go from struggling and working hard to get a better life for our kids, and then it gets to be comfortable, and then the next generation gets even more comfortable, and then we become too comfortable, and then we lose sight of how we got where we are, and then the cycle goes down the other. And we could probably talk about that for an hour, huh, David?
Well, and I think going back to money in general, I mean, we know that the percentage of millionaires that say that they inherited the majority of their wealth is extremely low. Like it's like 8%. And one of the reasons for that is normally it's kind of the same things that kind of kick in with professional athletes and stuff that we see is I think people, even when they get money or when they inherit it, they maybe didn't learn the rules that were associated with it or the principles associated with it. to learn how to keep it. And I think one of those essential components is work. Um, really learning to dig deep. In fact, the millionaires who did inherit it and who built upon their parents' kingdoms, kind of so to say, typically when you hear their stories, they were put to work in their parents' factories. You know what I mean? Learning from the ground up type thing. Um, Kind of like what my dad was trying to teach us, although he was just having us dig holes and plant trees and that kinds of stuff, right? But it
Yeah,
was manual labor, and hey, if we can learn to do that, then we'll appreciate when we can use our minds to do different things then later.
I love that. How did you get from interning and learning about the traditional investment world to teaching principles of money instead of, the traditional way? How did you get into that?
Yeah, it was I had my mentor and good friend Kyle Christensen. I'd known him for a couple of years out here in Oklahoma. I would come out here. I was working in the healthcare industry, actually on the client side, working with some different clients that we had, and definitely working with people. But I was talking with Kyle, and he's like, "Man, I hate bringing people into this, but he's like, I think you've got everything that it takes. So if you want to talk more, and I'll teach you everything that I know." And I liked Kyle enough, and I wasn't one to say no to an opportunity, at least right off the bat. So I was like, well, let's keep talking. Let's at least hear what you have to say. And the more I heard about it, and the more I listened and saw how he would walk through the principles with people and our discussions, the more things just clicked, and it was like, wow, this is a lot deeper and more clarity than I've ever had regarding these things. Um, and even all the years of learning that I'd had, learning quote unquote, um, it was interesting how quickly a lot of that was not unwound, but just put in context. I think in a more thorough way, um, and really going back to principles and saying, well, what is really guiding these decisions, and what's the purpose for this, and all these things are really tools, but what is the real end goal of them? And it just the more I learned about it, I was in it pretty quick. I mean, I'd go back and talk with my wife about it, and she's like, "You're grasping this, and it seems like this is the direction that you're wanting to go." um,
Yeah, yeah,
so
we've had similar experiences, and we share the same mentor. And he was on a previous podcast, and have him on. Yeah, he's an amazing human being, isn't he?
yep,
That's awesome.
yep,
Well, let's get into now. Of course, we know that you do a lot of wonderful work with the medical field, resident physicians and that kind of a thing. But I wanted you to focus today, if we could, on a couple things. One is obviously the student debt situation and repayments and um, forbearances and the timeline on how to pay student loan off and the different plan options available. It's always something that comes up, and I thought it would be great for you to tell us some of the basics of what people ought to know about the student loans in general and payment options and that kind of a thing. And at the end, if you could tie a bow on it, so to speak, and how it relates to why that's important with somebody's overall plan. And
yeah.
I think that will be helpful. So, uh, we have people that maybe know a little bit more about student loans that listen to the show than others, but I think it might be good to talk about some basics and what you've discovered through your years of learning and teaching people about student loan repayments and that kind of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So when early in my career, when I was working on just different avenues and where to work with people, one of the areas that I got into was working with some different residency programs. Which residency is right after medical school. It's when doctors are in kind of their training before they become full-fledged doctors. It's more like an apprenticeship in the historical context. Um, but one thing you see very quickly working with that crowd is huge amounts of student loans. So, I mean, 250,000, 400, or 500,000 is not uncommon to see. Um, so, like our principals teach, I mean, hey, when you're working through these things, you need to become an expert if you're going to be talking on them and dealing with them. So, one of the things that Kyle recommended to me is, hey, if you're going to work with this crowd, you should become an expert in this area. This is going to be a big thing to them, and if you can talk to it and speak to it, it'll resonate with them a lot faster. And so I started getting books on it, reading books and blogs, and just ingesting information from wherever I could at that point. Going through the government website, which is never fun, but I spent a lot of time there, and who knows if it was accurate or not, right? But so just pulled as much as I could, and then was able to work with clients a lot faster on it and talking through things with them, and realize, wow, yeah, I'm helping them understand this in a lot more succinct and clear way. One of the things you see very quickly with it is, at least with government student loans, federal student loans, the government doesn't get rid of old programs, they just come up with new ones. So we've had years and years and generations really of just layered options on top of these things that have been from different administrations, different reasons. I mean, very different causes that led to them. And as we look through it now, it's just a big jumbled mess with people, right? So looking back on it kind of from a baseline, yeah, I mean, you want me to just go into them in
Yeah,
basics of student loans
absolutely.
then?
Yes, that'd be
So
great.
and this, I mean, it was interesting to me, even after I'd been doing it for a couple of years. I was actually in Salt Lake I had lunch with a couple of different financial planners and advisors, and they'd been in the industry 20, 30 years. I mean, I was the young buck at the table for all intents and purposes. But student loan topic came up, and all of them were like, oh no, when clients say that, yeah, whatever payment plan you're on, just go ahead. And I was listening to all these guys talk, and I was like, what? Like, you guys have been in the industry forever and you don't know anything about this? It like really shocked me, Tim. Um, and Kyle was there with me, and he's like, well, you should talk to David about it. And they asked a couple of questions. I was like, no, I mean, this is an option. And what about this? And they were like blown away by it. It was really fascinating, especially for me. I was like, man, I was I was really shocked that they just didn't know much. It was just they would kind of take whatever their clients say and say, oh yeah, well, that's their plan. Then go ahead and keep paying on that, and we'll deal with the rest of your plan. Um, which is kind of how financial planning is in traditional sense for most advisors, right? Like they kind of focus on the investment side alone, and everything else is dealt with kind of topically if needed. But otherwise, they kind of get to where they can make money. You know what I mean?
Right.
Um, and that really points to in student loans, there's not really money to be made. At least I haven't capitalized on it yet, right? Directly.
Right.
um, it's just it's something that we're helping people with, so which you can see why people don't put a lot of effort into it. Um, but it was interesting. So there's some big fundamental differences with how student loans work, at least again from the federal student loan perspective. We've been taught in general to not like debt, maybe to abhor debt, right?
Right.
I mean, you hear people, and Dave Ramsey has a huge platform. It's just get out of debt as fast as you can, pay it off as fast as we can, right? And I get it. And in a lot of situations, like that's just what people need to do, especially consumer debt. It can be pretty terrible. And some of the reasons for that is we hear about interest and how interest compounds, and we pay interest on our interest, and that just leads to a real terrible cycle that we don't want to get into. So one of the first things with federal student loans that I teach is that the interest actually is not compounding. Okay, so
Interesting.
it's not, if you have 10% interest on $100, after a year you have $110. And then if you don't pay anything on it, well, then it's 10% on that 10%. So now it's $11 in interest, right? So then it's 121, and that compounds. It's the miracle of compounding interest that works against us, and it goes up exponentially if we leave it long enough, right?
Right.
So we don't like that, and we try to at least pay on the interest. And I would see that with a lot of residents. They'd be, hey, at least if I can stay on top of this. So learning about that wait, this is actually, it's what's called simple interest. It's you have your principal amount, and whatever your interest rate is accruing off of that principal amount, and then it dumps it into what's called the accrual basket or bucket. And when people pull up the studentaid.gov website and they log into their student loans, they'll see it on there. They have their principal and they have their accrued interest. At least they did before the forced forbearance from the government over the past 3.5 years. Right?
Right.
It'll still show it on there, but maybe they graduated in the meantime and it just shows zero on that number, so they haven't paid attention to it. But I'd oftentimes see it where there's somebody with a $300,000 balance and $50,000 of accrued interest. right? And the reason that's separate is because the interest is only earning on the principal balance, not on the accrued interest.
Which is the simple interest you were talking about, not compounding.
Simple interest, that's right. So then I get wanting to pay off the interest, but if you're just paying off the interest and it's not earning any interest, it's actually not putting you that much further ahead, right? As much as they would have anticipated previously, right?
Interesting.
There's
Yeah.
not the urgency for it, I guess, right? It doesn't mean go and just spend that money at Arby's or something, um, but it's just kind of understanding that contextualized part. Now it does have compounding or what's called capitalizing events, where that accrued box gets combined with the principal balance and then begins earning interest. So, and there are a lot of events that can trigger that compounding of the interest. So, like graduation. Okay, you finished school, great, congratulations. It's a capitalizing event. All that accrued interest during your residency or whatever is now part of your principal balance and earning interest. Okay. Um,
Oh,
so when you choose
so
a repayment plan, end of the grace period, not making payments, defaulting essentially, right? Changing plans, like anytime we monkey with or change our payment structure and stuff, it's pretty much a capitalizing event. We're consolidating loans, capitalizing event. All that interest becomes part of the principal. Boom, it starts over, and then you have your new accrued interest box that's starting at zero again. Does
so
that make sense?
post graduation is where you really need to be on top of it because then it starts working against you,
Mm-hmm.
correct?
Mm-hmm. I mean, understanding how it's going to work pre-graduation is nice because you can get your ducks in a row, right? So some people want to like consolidate all their loans. They have a bunch from all these different years of undergrad and then from graduate school and all this kinds of stuff. And all of a sudden they have 15 different loans and they want to consolidate them into one loan. And that's fine. Great. Yeah, you can certainly do that. It's a capitalizing event. So don't wait for, 6 months after you graduate to do that because you're just letting that accrued interest build for another 6 months. Then it's going to all capitalize 6 months later than if you would have done it right at graduation. Does that make sense?
Oh, interesting. And before I get into ask you some questions about your recommendations you give to people, there are federal loans and there's private loans that are packaged by investors, basically. Can you tell us the difference between a federal loan and a private loan package? And do you have the choice of what you get, or how does that kind of work?
Yeah, and it certainly seems like I work with people kind of across the spectrum on that, but the majority of folks that I'm working with have gone through graduate programs and then they're getting federal student loans at the graduate level. So higher interest rates, not subsidized, but they are still through the federal loans. They're direct loans from the federal student loan agency, right? That was all it used to all be kind of privatized pre 2009, I want to say, and then the government kind of took it all under their umbrella. But there are still private institutions that do the loans. Okay, people do it through Wells Fargo or whatever. And then sometimes people, when they have their student loans, they'll refinance them. They'll start getting all kinds of mail and stuff at the end of their, um, you know, getting close to graduation from SoFi or Laurel Road or you know what I mean, a whole
Yes.
branch of them, and we can refinance your loans and give you a lower interest rate, et cetera, et cetera. Takes them out of the federal bucket and into the private market. And then they
Is
don't
that a good
have
idea?
it depends on the situation, right? So I mean, a lot of our answers are going to be that.
Yeah, right.
um,
Yeah.
very few circumstances at this point have I recommended that because then you lose some of the advantages from some of the federal student loan repayment programs that are normally more advantageous than what the private loans are offering, right? For instance, the private loans will always advertise like a lower interest rate. Um, one of the ways that they do that, and sometimes it's just a little bit lower, although, I mean, when interest rates were really low, it was substantially lower. But one of the things that they do is they assume that you're going to do auto pay. And when you do auto pay with the private loans, they give you a 0.25% discount on your interest rate. Right. Well, what they
Yeah,
don't tell
right.
you is you can have that 0.25% discount on your federal student loans too if you set up auto pay.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So it's like, but they'll say, oh well, this is your current interest rate, and this is what we can get you, and it's definitely a 0.25% lower, but they're assuming you're going to do the auto pay. right? So it's just kind of those sales techniques that are sometimes used that might not be as good as what it seems at first blush, right? So
Okay. Oh, that's really interesting. I know a lot of people always wondered about that.
mhm.
Um, now, so I know every case is different, David, but as you go through a process with somebody on the payment plan, the repayment options, what are some general kind of conversations you may have, or maybe a case or two that you can remember in terms of people's options for repayment, and some advice that maybe comes up on your end of how to, how the repayment works in their favor, and especially with their overall planning?
Yeah, so sometimes it's, and you know this, Tim, because we want people to understand why they're doing what they're doing, not just tell them what to do.
Right.
Um, and we want that because, I mean, not because we don't want them to come back to us, but but when you give people the real information, they know why they're making the decision, then when they're challenged on it later or whatever, at least they can go back to their reasons why. So that's why like explaining to people about interest and how it works is kind of a baseline discussion, because then it can help them understand, especially when they're still in training or income is still low. They feel that urgency to still pay on the interest, and it can kind of get them off of that rock a little bit. It's like, hey, is that still have the same urgency to make those payments right now? And once they realize that it's simple interest and it's not putting them further ahead, they're like, well, no, I guess not. Right. And it's still okay if they want to put the money into like a bank account and keep control of it and then make a lump sum payment later on. I'm totally cool with that. But I would rather my clients have more flexibility and more control over their finances rather than feeling limited. And when things happen, then they don't have options. Right.
And so in the case when there's simple interest in the accrual bucket, as you mentioned, it might be better to just concentrate on paying the principal down, maybe when they're in the early stages of their career, because it's not really benefiting them to pay both or just pay the interest if it's simple interest.
Well, it's tricky. Like you can't actually just pay the principal down, right? If you're going to make a payment, they want you to pay the interest first. Right.
Right.
That's kind of how they get around that. But if you're going to make a payment, and sometimes people are paying extra towards them, it's just helping them understand, is that really accomplishing what you want it to? And when you go back to the reasoning of why people are doing it, typically it's because, well, I don't want that interest to be earning interest. So if you have $100,000 at 6% interest, I mean, that's $6,000 in interest a year. And so people are like, well, I want to pay at least 500 a month just so it doesn't have that interest growing and I don't earn more interest on that interest. It's like, well, I can understand that. But if you're not earning interest on that interest, is it still worth it to make the $500 payment monthly? Or maybe you put that aside into a separate bank account where you can pay $6,000 at the end of the year. But in the meantime, if something happened, you still have the money.
So it's about being prepared too. And so if you just focus on the student loan repayment as fast as you can, that could be detrimental to other aspects of their planning, like saving maybe in a good high yield savings account or something where they can build it up and pay it at the end of the year. Like you said, you have to take one decision of how to pay a debt off and how it may affect other parts of your planning, right?
Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, yeah, they could be saving that money. I mean, even in a savings account right now at 4% interest, and at least earn some interest on that money during the year, turn around and pay the $6,000 in interest off on their student loans. They're actually further ahead because at least they were gaining the interest during the year on their bank account. Right now, it's
Right.
taxable interest. It's just going to be a little bit, but it's understanding at least those facets. And the bigger the numbers, obviously, the more substantial it can be, right? But more often than not, what we see is that people make these big financial decisions that tighten up and limit their options in the future. And then something else comes along, but they're now limited and they can't capitalize or need to take out more debt in like a credit card or something like that because they can't handle that situation. Right. And now all of a sudden they're in a worse situation because they were trying to pay so much extra on their student loans that really wasn't as advantageous as they previously thought because the interest isn't compounding.
Oh,
Right.
that's a really good point. So if somebody is focused, maybe overly focused on the debt pay down, and they're not creating some type of an emergency fund because life is full of unexpected events, right? So if they're if they're extremely focused on the debt pay down, but they don't have any reserves for a car repair or a refrigerator going out or something like that, that could possibly make the situation worse.
Mm-hmm. And that's normally where people are at is when they're trying to pay that off, they're kind of using all of their excess money towards that, right? So, and it kind of goes into the second step of it, which is I normally ask people, I was like, what is the driving, what's the big determining factor that decides how quickly you eliminate your debts, right? And when they look back on it, they're like, oh, and they'll throw out some different answers, but really it's how much they decide to put towards it, right? How much
Right.
of their income they want to pay towards it. And I say, okay, good. Does your payment plan dictate that, right? Or can you pay more than your payment plan? And they're like, well, normally you can pay more than it. It's like, okay, cool. So unless they lack all financial self-discipline, right, which sometimes happens, in that case, then we want to pick a payment plan that's going to force them to do it more or less, right, or have a really strong system set up for them. But normally people can, once they understand that, then they're like, okay, so how much I decide to pay towards it is actually what determines it. So maybe I should pick a plan that gives me the most flexibility within my overall financial plan. And if it's a small required payment, that may be advantageous because there may be things that happen down the road in a couple of years where if I have the option to slow down how much I'm paying on that and divert those resources elsewhere with a more urgent cause, that could be beneficial for my overall plan. And
Oh,
then
that's
when the
really
cause
interesting.
passes, right? Maybe there's a medical thing that happens, right? I have a client that had a big medical procedure that had to get done, right? And had some additional expenses. Thankfully, it's all okay and they're coming out of it. But their required payment was very low. Now they were paying a whole bunch towards it, but the required payment, the payment plan that we chose, was one that would offer more flexibility within their plan overall, right? And so then when that happened, they were able to divert those extra resources over there, still keep their minimum payment in place. They weren't defaulting, but then in the meantime, then when that other event had passed, they were able to put their resources back towards eliminating the debt like they'd wanted to.
Well, that's really good, David. That brings up another point that we've alluded to. If we're conditioned as a society that all debt is bad, right? Even leveraged debt, we just all debt is bad. And if you focus psychologically on that, you, like I said, you if you that may force you into a position where you give up all flexibility for future events that may happen, and they usually do, by focusing on the psychological foundation of having to pay off the debt as quickly as possible. So I just love what you just said, that we don't want to sacrifice flexibility for the big bad evil green monster under the bed, which is, the all debt is bad, right? So
That's right. Yeah,
flexibility is key.
and it does become an emotional issue at times.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say that directly to a lot of clients, right? Because you don't want it to, right?
Right.
But it does. We have like an emotional attachment. We really feel strongly like I just want to get rid of that. And sometimes it's because we know that once we get rid of it, then it opens up other doors, which is normally more debt anyways, which is kind of the funny thing. But once we can kind of bridge across that in the right way, and sometimes it's good emotional um, aspects that are driving it, right? Like we don't want the debt because we don't like the feeling of having to owe someone other money, and that feels captivating, and in a way it is, right? Absolutely. So it's not that I'm saying not to pay it, but strategically, the overall picture, yes, we want to get rid of the debt, but tactically, how do we go about approaching that day to day, month to month, year to year? And sometimes if all we do is focus on debt, it might actually be leading us away from our overall financial objectives, right? If I'm trying to get to better health and I go to the doctor for an ER visit because my appendix burst, right? Okay, I saw the
Yeah.
doctor, checked that box. I mean, he would have told me if there was something else that was needed at that point. I got my appendix taken care of. I'm in good health, right? But is that going
Right.
to get me to optimal health? Like, no, right? And maybe that's a poor analogy of it all, but sometimes people focus so much on one part that they might be missing, or it might be actually leading them away from what they're trying to accomplish somewhere else too.
Oh, I love that. That's actually really a great point. Before I ask you to give a practical kind of a money maverick tip of the week when it comes to maybe student loans or debt repayment, we'll ask you to give a quick practical tip to the listeners. Tell us what your feeling is on forbearances. That's a common thing that comes up all the time. I did forbearances early on in my life with my student loans, and now I wonder, why did I do that for? But there's a purpose for it. But what are your general thoughts about forbearances
Yeah.
on student loans?
Normally I'm against them, right? But the reason being is because I understand what options people have available, and normally the reason people choose to forbear is because they don't understand the options, right? Or
Mm,
because the information that they received wasn't complete, or maybe it was the wrong information overall, which I hear all the time. So pre March, 2020, when all loans were put in forced forbearance by the federal government, right? All student loans,
right.
at least federally held student loans. Before that, probably about 70% of the residents and physicians that I would talk with were in forbearance during residency. So they would go into residency and basically they're making 50 grand a year, but I mean, they still have expenses and still have lifestyle and all that kinds of stuff. Some of them have families, right? And it's really expensive. They don't know what to do. And so they're like, look, and they see this big standard repayment plan, which is it's going to force you to repay your loans in 10 years, and they have $250,000 in student loans at 6% interest. And it's like, shoot, that required payment is like 3,500 a month. That's like my whole income as a resident. So no, I can't do that. And they call up in a fret and worried, right? Emotionally driven, instead of principally driven, right? and the emotions are, hey, I can't do this. I'm in residency. What options do I have? And the person in the federal student aid, .gov website says, oh, well, you can forbear if you're in residency. Oh, I can? Yeah. All through residency, you can go into forbearance where you don't have to pay anything on them. They say, oh, that sounds way better not paying anything than paying 3,500 a month, right? And it's a
Right.
false dichotomy though, which we often get in our society. It's way more nuanced than that, right? um, and it's really in the nuances and in the details that all of our options get flushed out. So most often people choose forbearance because it's just the easy option. It's okay, I don't have to pay on it. It's easy to understand. We can connect the dots. Okay, I just forbear, it's there, and then later on I'll pick it up. The trouble with it is all of your loans are still growing. Now it's simple interest, right? But it's going into that accrual bucket. But when you finish forbearance and you choose a payment plan, it's a capitalizing event, compounding event.
Interesting.
So if I have a client with that $250,000, or let's say 200,000, just for easy math, right? At 6% interest, that's $12,000 of interest a year. If they're in residency for 3 years, okay, that's $36,000 in accrued interest, capitalizing event after the forbearance ends. And they would wait until 6 months after residency to start their payment plan, because that's how long they'd allow you to forbear, 6 months after graduation or that kind of deal. Great. At that point, now they have so 36,000 from the 3 years, and then an extra 6 months. So they're at $42,000 of interest, accrued interest, that now becomes part of their balance. Now they have $242,000 earning interest. Right now, instead of $12,000, it's what does that work out to be? 14,200 and something, right, of interest a year. Okay, so it's
Yeah,
another
yeah.
$2,500 of interest essentially a year that they have to cut through before it would hit their principal amount, right? So forbearance, it was a short-term game of not having to pay anything on it, and it was an easy decision, and that's what I'd see a lot of residents that would choose, right? When if they would look at if they would have had somebody that would help them understand some of the details of the other plans. I mean, you have a lot of the standard plans, standard, which is a 10-year repayment, and then extended, which is 20 years, but it's still going to pay them all off. And then you have graduated, which is over 10 years, but it increases every 2 years. Then you have extended graduated, which is over 20 years and it increases every 2 years. And even looking at those ones with that $200,000 balance, their starting payment is like $500-600 a month. and on a $3,500 salary with a family and doing all these things, they're like, I can't even do that. Let me just pause it all. Right. And those are kind of the four standard plans that are designed to actually pay off your loans in a certain period of time. Okay. Which is how our minds are programmed to think about student loans. Then there's non-standard repayments, as I would call them, right? Or the income-driven repayments plans, which because the loans are held by the government doesn't have to be profitable, right? So they
Right.
actually said, well, rather than people defaulting and not paying on these loans at all, let's at least come up with a plan that'll get some revenue rather than nothing at all. And so they came up with these plans that were designed around that. And those ones, depending on the loan balance and the person's income, they may or may not actually ever pay off that person's loans. But
Interesting.
if you understand how they work, they may be a useful tool within that person's plan to give them some different options. And normally there's some options that people could choose where they would have very low loan payments that would give them options during those earlier years until their income increased. But then strategically, they could still apply more towards their loans. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that's awesome. That's excellent advice. And the theme from our chat today, David, is give yourself know your options first and foremost. Don't just blindly go into some kind of a payment plan or forbearance. Know your options and give yourself flexibility for life events. That seems to be some great advice that you're giving.
Yeah.
Is understand what your options are.
And I think stepping back, even like, what's your real objective? And then we can learn our options, right? Is our objective just to get rid of debt, or is our objective financial freedom? Right?
Right.
Because that context even lays it out more broadly, and depending on which one it is, we may strategically attack them differently than otherwise, right? Um, and then we can learn what are the options with that, and then okay, well, now dealing with the debt alone, what are my options even further? But it has to be kind of in that context of what are we going for overall, because then we're looking at our dollars in general, and normally people have a finite number of dollars that they're going to earn. Some will earn a larger number, but it's still finite. And so if we can have those do more for us or go further for us, that's ideal.
Well, I love that. That is really good advice. Well, David, we've reached the end here. And before we have you give maybe a really quick practical tip for the audience on something they can do right now with either debt in general or student loans, um, how can people get a hold of you, especially people that are in the medical residency field or know somebody that is? What are some good ways people can get a hold of you?
Sure. I mean, they can just email me. I'm kind of old school with some of that stuff, right? Although I'm a young
Okay.
guy, I'm just an old soul at heart. So David at uniqueadvantage.biz, B-I-Z. Um, that's my
Okay.
email. I mean, you can share my phone number and that kinds of stuff too. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn under David Mullen, Mullin. Uniqueadvantage.biz, our website for our group. There's ways to get a hold of me on there then too. So in any way that we can help, I mean, we'll be there.
Okay, great. And we'll post that on the website as well, the Money Maverick
Thank you. I
website.
appreciate that. Mhm.
As we end up and say farewell for now, what's a really quick practical tip that someone might be able to go out today with when it's dealing with what we've talked about today that they can maybe apply in their lives right now?
On student loans specifically,
Yeah. Yes.
um, that the government just came out with a new plan here recently called the SAVE plan, which I think is kind of funny that they're just messing up that word even further. Um, but it is they have been trying to forgive student loans for one way or another, for one reason or another, but they couldn't do it, through executive order and that kinds of stuff. But they were through some bureaucracy, right? And so the Department of Education came up with a new repayment called the SAVE one. They did try to make it where it's like the obvious option for everybody. And within that one, I mean, it's really worth it in most circumstances, most, not all, to really explore that one, to give it a good hard look. The required payments are very low, which you can still pay more, that's fine. But then if you're not paying enough to even cover the interest, they'll forgive all of that other interest. So kind of powerful to look at. Again, it's very new. Just got released here in August, so it's the newest of them all. But if they're not on that already, or if they were on repay, they'll automatically be moved to that. But yeah, just knowing the options, just spending some time talking to us. I mean, we're not going to charge you anything for that kinds of stuff, just to learn about those things. And if you want to talk more about other things, wonderful. But yeah, you can talk to Tim, you can talk to me. I mean, we can walk through that stuff and at least give you some track to run on so you can make better financial decisions. That's what it really comes down to.
Well, love it, David. We appreciate you being our money maverick this week, and for the wonderful tips and insights and advice you gave. It's a big subject for a lot of people. Thank you so much for joining us, and for all of you out there, we hope you were able to get some new insights and things you didn't know before about debt and student loans in general. Thank you, David, again for your time. We'll see you next time on the Money Maverick podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.